Hello and welcome. My name is Alexander Sikorsky, and I'm a fellow at the Human Rights Foundation, where we partner with world-changing activists in creating innovative solutions to unite the world against tyranny. Today, I am excited to introduce a panel event at South by Southwest on the growing role of technology in protest movements. Though taking place on other sides of the globe, the 2020 democracy movements in Hong Kong and Belarus had many things in common. Protesters and activists organized spontaneously on encrypted messaging apps, used Bitcoin to hide their transactions from government tracing, and swapped tips and experiences to support one another. This panel will explore the connections between the protests in Belarus and Hong Kong, focusing on the role that new technologies play in the struggle against authoritarianism. On our panel today, we have both experts and participants in the 2020 democracy protests from Hong Kong and Belarus. Hanna Lyubakova is an independent Belarusian journalist and democracy activist currently at the Atlantic Council. She previously worked at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and for Belsat TV, an independent Belarusian TV station. Yaroslav Lichachevsky is a Belarusian entrepreneur and the founder of Baisol, a fundraising organization for the Belarusian opposition that has pioneered the use of Bitcoin to send millions of euros to help repress people in Belarus. Yuan Yang is the deputy Beijing bureau chief of the Financial Times. She writes extensively about technology in China and reported on the 2020 Hong Kong democracy movement. Glacier Kwong is a digital rights activist from Hong Kong and the founder of Keyboard Frontline, where she advocates for digital independence and human rights. She participated in the Umbrella movement in Hong Kong in 2014 and continues to advocate for democracy in Hong Kong today. And finally, moderating the discussion, we have Dr. Aleś Gerasimenko, a researcher at the Computational Propaganda Project at the Oxford Internet Institute. His work investigates how political groups and governments use social media to manipulate public opinion, as well as how people organize protest movements in authoritarian countries. Thank you to everyone at South by for joining us today, and I hope you learn and enjoy this insightful discussion.
To start with, I would like to invite everyone to speak briefly, maybe for no more than 5 minutes or less, about their vision regarding the importance of the use of technologies such as social media platforms, messaging platforms like Telegram, blockchain technologies, or any types of apps like Siphon that helped or somehow been used by political activists during those recent events in Hong Kong and Belarus I mentioned. So I'd like to start in a way I introduced each of you, and perhaps we're going to start with Yuan. Yuan, please. You're welcome.
Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm based here in Beijing with the Financial Times, where I've been for the last 5 years now. And of course, reporting during the year of COVID has been a very special year for us in China. As reporters here, we've met with increasing digital surveillance as well as human and physical surveillance in the mainland. However, there have been interesting hotspots, I would say, not strictly of digital activism, but certainly of digital awareness raising in the mainland, given the difficulty of any form of activism under the authoritarian state and the Communist Party's rule here. For example, this time last year, around the death of the Wuhan-based Dr. Li Wenliang, who was known for being one of the early whistleblowers warning of an unknown pneumonia causing virus spreading in the city of Wuhan. He was then disciplined by the police for discussing this in a WeChat messaging group. WeChat is, of course, the dominant social messaging platform in China. It's almost impossible to function, I would say, as a normal citizen in China without using WeChat, but unfortunately, it's also heavily surveilled by the state. And this is, of course, a necessary consequence of using WeChat or using any major social media platform that is Chinese here. So after his death, which occurred last year on February the 7th, just a few days ago, we've just had his anniversary of his death. There was an outpouring of grief on Weibo, which is another of the major blogging platforms in China, a bit similar to Twitter, people were leaving notes saying how much they were saddened to hear of his death, how inspiring he was, and also repeating one of his well-known quotes, which is the idea that in a healthy society, there should be more than one voice. Of course, this quote gets to the heart of what people see as a major problem at the heart of China's authoritarianism and China's control over digital speech and all forms of speech. If there's only one voice in a country like China, then how can we be warned of future problems, future crises like the pandemic? How can we enjoy a fruitful debate about policies in the direction of the country? So I think the way that social media played into spreading the story of Li Wenliang and spreading his legacy is almost more of a therapeutic one. We see outpourings of grief on Weibo and on WeChat, often in a very nuanced way. People are not posting, I hate the police for arresting Li Wenliang. It's more subtle than that. Pictures of candles or other images of the man himself in his face mask or in his doctor uniform, to be more subtle and to get around censorship. So I would say firstly that we've seen digital media in China as an important, almost a therapeutic use under an authoritarian state where there's very little ability to speak out and to disagree with government policy or police policy. It's a realm in which people can have a little bit of room in which they can share their feelings and find common feeling. And I would say this is the most important aspect, I think, of what digital media in China can do right now, is to let people know that they're not alone, despite the state media, despite the propaganda, in their critiques of the system. Of course, there's a lot more to say about the way that the protests have happened in Hong Kong, and I'll leave that to Glacier to say. But a lot of the tools used by Hong Kong activists, I think, have also been translated to the mainland. For example, in labor activism over the last few years, which is still, of course, a minority of very brave students who were willing to confront the government in a much more heads-on kind of way, which is quite rare here in China, using apps like Telegram or other encrypted messaging apps in order to get off the kind of WeChat-dominated social media platform. But I'll hand over back to you and also back to Glacier to speak more about Hong Kong.
Thank you a lot, Glacier.
Hi, I'm Glacier Kwong. I'm born and raised in Hong Kong, and currently I am in Germany pursuing my doctoral studies. And in the last 2 years, we have witnessed a social movement in Hong Kong that is unprecedented. This is something that is actually very new, even for a lot of activists that are in Hong Kong. For the anti-extra bill movement, we rely a lot on internet and technologies to coordinate and organize the movement, because this is the first leaderless movement that has ever happened in Hong Kong. That is to say, there is no top-down manner of having a group of people to decide what people want to do. Basically, people organize among themselves, and there is no one to tell them what is the right thing to do in order to keep the movement moving. Most of the efforts that we see on television or on the streets are basically organized by themselves, and this is basically done through social media, communication app, and crowdsourcing, and so on. And it made the movement, and it made it into something that we have never seen before. But at the same time, technologies actually brings us a lot of threats, because no matter it is the communication records that we have in a phone, or we are clocking in the shop that is supportive of the movement, it all kind of expose who we are and where we are, and expose us into dangers. So, in very general sense, because every existence online leaves a trace. That means if you have a trace, that means there's something to track you down. So Hong Kongers inside the movement it's all the time facing this kind of very delicate balance between how do I make use of technology without putting myself in too much risk. For example, we use Telegram a lot in order to organize ourselves, because there is this function called a Telegram channel, and we use it to deliver messages or convey messages about the movement. For example, where are the police? How many police are there on the streets? Is there something happening on the street? Who is being arrested? And is that person gonna get legal assistance, and so on? So people actually follow a lot of these channels on Telegram in order to get news about the movement that is taking place all over Hong Kong. And at the same time, some people are talking about using blockchain technology to document what have happened in Hong Kong. After the incident that took place on the 21st of July in MTR station in Hong Kong, there was a mob attack inside the station where police were slow to react. And afterwards, people found out that the police or the government were trying to amend the statements about that event. So people were worried, and some people started to use blockchain to try to document what actually happened on that day, what actually happened throughout the movement, in order to make sure that those facts does not get tampered or amended. And so this is a very new use of the blockchain technology, because in Hong Kong, usually people just use Bitcoin to trade and so on to hide their identity. And at the same time, we also see the increased use of digital surveillance. And we see a trend where we're slowly moving towards the route that China and a lot of Chinese cities have gone through. That is a lot of cameras, a lot of apps that you have to use to clock in, especially under the COVID-19 situation. The Hong Kong government made use of the pandemic and introduced an app called Leave Home Safe, and now requires everyone, if they want to enter government premises or enter certain premises, to use that app to clock in and clock out, so that the government can know wherever they were during that period. And the worrying thing is, a lot of people don't find it to be very problematic. They think, oh, I'm not doing it during a protest. We are not clocking in during a protest, so that shouldn't be a lot of problem. But to be honest, in the world of data, 1 + 1 is bigger than 2. I can only deduce that you have been to a restaurant on a certain day. That cannot tell a lot about you. But if I can gather your patterns, for example, you always frequent those shops that are supportive of the movement, I can fairly deduce that you are part of the anti-government movement already. But in Hong Kong, not a lot of people are very worried about that. We are increasingly worried about our digital hygiene and digital security. In general, we are still very kind of passive in terms of defending ourselves. And there is a significant change recently, because Facebook changed its privacy policy to share WhatsApp data with Facebook. So a lot of people migrated to Signal, that end-to-end encryption app that is open sourced and do not store a lot of data. And that is actually a very positive sign to see the use of data, because during the movement, people have been talking about, oh, they have to use end-to-end encryption for anything that is related to the movement. But now people are migrating to Signal on a daily basis. So they're using Signal even for like just regular chit chat between friends. So that is actually a very positive change in terms of the use of technology for under this kind of social circumstances. And at the same time, we have very creative use of technology as well. For those who have an iPhone, if you were in Hong Kong during 2019, often enough you will receive airdrop from random strangers on the MTR or on public transport. And those things that they're airdropping to you are actually photos that are telling you about when is the next protest going to happen, where is it, and I hope to see you there. So it's actually very warm and very, very on point as well, because you feel like, oh, there's actually people that are very supportive of the movement all around you, and they're telling you, I'm inviting you to this next movement or next protest. I want to see you there, and please stay safe, and so on. So it's actually making that pro-democracy camp more closely knitted, and you feel like personally very supported by that. So these are some of the use of technology that I see in Hong Kong's movement last year. So I would love to hear about Belarus. Yes.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Gracia, a lot for your extensive introduction into the Hong Kong story. And let's hear now. Exactly. Let's hear from Belarus. Let's hear from our panelists from Belarus, and we start with Hanna Lubakova. Hanna, please.
Hi, thank you, Alice, and hello, everyone. Well, thank you for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to talk to people from Hong Kong. I think throughout this month, the amount of support I received from Hong Kongers is just immense. Basically, I feel so connected to you guys right now. Yeah, so when it comes to Belarus, I would say that, despite what media around the world wrote, I would disagree that it is a Telegram revolution. I was in Minsk when the internet was shut down in August, and people were on the streets despite there was no internet, there was no connection, and people could not read those Telegram messages at all. They used whatever means were available. They called. They used phones and called their relatives and kind of people in other cities to get information about what was happening. They used leaflets, they used word of mouth, and we were traveling by car. I'm a reporter, so I was kind of, roaming around the city and looking for demonstrations, for rallies, because we did not know where those were happening. And basically, like there were those bikers, like motorbikers, and they were, stopping us and kind of knocking on our window and asking us in a car, do you know where is something happening? Is there any demonstration or anything like that? So basically, it was obviously the ability to mobilize, right? Their own willingness to go and protest that actually drove them to the streets, not Telegram itself. So let's just not ignore the role of protesters and the kind of reasons why they went out to the streets in the first place. However, as we gathered here to discuss technology obviously provided an important infrastructure for protesters and gave a platform for people to connect. It amplified their voices. It gave the online space for discussions and debates, and basically influenced how traditional media report on the protests. And kind of most importantly, I think it made people united. Like when I'm trying to analyze this Telegram phenomenon in Belarus, I'm asking myself why there is so much trust in social media and social networks in this platform. And basically, kind of some of the conclusions I'm having is that, in the past years, independent outlets and social media established a virtual monopoly over people's minds. Belarusians, the majority, turned away from state media and kind of because they were spreading fake news, lies, and it was especially visible during the pandemic when social networks and independent media became the most important source of information about the real situation with COVID in Belarus. So that's the reason why people kind of keep trusting social media now during the protests. Now, regarding censorship, in recent years and months prior to the election, and I think people keep forgetting about that, the Belarusian authorities already already tested their ability to limit access to the internet. Months before the election in Minsk, there were already cases when the internet was shut down. So we journalists knew that like mobile internet could disappear at any moment and there would not be kind of any free flow of information. So we were trying to get ready for this. And people behind most popular Telegram channels also kind of began publishing, posting instructions of how to circumvent censorship. So by August 2020, many people, especially in those kind of major cities, big cities, became knowledgeable enough about VPNs, about Siphon, and other ways how to send and receive data through secure network tunnels. So it was kind of amazing. There was this joke that Lukashenko is a PR manager of Telegram because he made Telegram so kind of popular and important. So when the election day came and there was kind of this major internet blackout, Belarusians turned to Telegram because that was the only major digital communication platform that still worked. And some of these channels that became like super popular, such as Nechta, like Nexta Life, Belarus of the Brain, and some others, they kind of they provided this information about the protest movement and police kind of violence in those police movements in the city. And this information was so important for like even those people who did not want to come out to the street and protest, but they just wanted to get safely from their work, to home, so that they kind of needed this information about where something was happening, and whether they would not get into trouble by taking this route or another. So that's why, this social kind of these Telegram channels became so popular, so important. Basically, the Telegram now remains widely used in kind of organization of the protests, coordination of the demonstrations, and like these Telegram channels basically every day give to-do lists for protesters, what they should do, whether they should gather on this street or another street in these neighborhoods or in a different neighborhoods. What I think we are observing now is that the protest movement is kind of becoming localized, and people, because of this repressions and the fact that police are identifying people behind Telegram channels, they are kind of now these are closed chats and people communicate via closed chats. So this is not kind of this open and these huge channels are kind of switching into different format. They spread information, but people communicate with each other in like via closed chats, right? So that's kind of the main difference. And well, it's a leaderless, it's a decentralized movement, and like people behind the channels remain mostly anonymous still. And what I think is important is that kind of these channels created the alternative communication space for people, right? And most importantly, now, and this kind of to answer the question why this movement is more successful than previous ones, is because I think those Telegram channels helped build horizontal connections between the people, because previously it was mostly like automized society. People did not communicate much, which changed most recently. And for me, it's kind of the most important outcome. Yeah, so this kind of explains why now it's kind of more successful than before, and it just will help in the future build this kind of basis for self-governance.
Thank you, Rana. Now we know a lot about Belarus, but we still have another perspective on Belarus, I believe, and this comes from Yaroslav Lichachowski. Yaroslav, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ales. Glad to be here with you guys. Yeah, Hannah already provided a lot. I don't know what even to add here. I've been born and raised in Belarus and Minsk, and then moved to Western Europe, living in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and working on the AI field. But for the last half a year, I've been heavily involved in the protest movement in Belarus. And a couple of days ago, we had a meeting with the U.S. ambassador, and she asked what changed since 2010, when the last big protest was in Belarus. So my answer is definitely that the technology that drives lots of processes and that enables lots of stuff we can do now. And one of them you covered broadly is the connecting people and providing information within new media and new channels of communication. But also we had lots and lots of tech projects that played a great game during the election process. Like we had the app called Voice. It's actually a chatbot that enabled computer vision for voting ballots during the election days. So we had an alternative way to count the voices during the election. And my cup of tea here is providing financial support for people who've been repressed in Belarus. So like a couple of days after the election, in August, we launched Belarus Solidarity Foundation, which, as Alice mentioned previously, is a crowdfunding platform that helps to first of all, collect funds all around the world from all Belarusian diasporas and all people who support in democracy in Belarus. And it was still not possible 10 years ago at all. And the second problem that we are solving is that the bank system is totally controlled by government in Belarus. So you can do nothing with money transfers without officials knowing it. And that's where blockchain comes, and we're using cryptocurrencies to distribute this financial support. And by now we've learned thousands and thousands of workers in Belarusian plants and state-owned enterprises how to use crypto wallets and how to operate with blockchain and with bitcoins, and like that's fascinating because you could never believe that simple guy from Belarusian rural area would ever use bitcoins to buy himself some food. And yeah, I love it.
Well, great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for your introductory notes on the situations in mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Belarus, and around these spaces. We heard a lot about different uses of technologies, ranging from how to deal with, how to address a need to fund a movement, to this new amazing creative ways of using blockchain to transfer data just across or save data or transfer data if needed. It sounds very interesting, and I think one of the things that unites, well, now I think we don't have much time, but let's try to have a few questions in dynamic mode and discuss few common things that emerged, I think, from our discussion. All right. So shall we start with an issue of control, right? Issue of, you all mentioned some attempts of the authoritarian states, movements or activists or people who just want to express themselves should deal with, right? Authoritarian control, censorship. You mentioned surveillance. You mentioned all types of attempts to control speech. If you briefly mention, maybe I'll first invite Johan, and anyone else would want to contribute further. Please let me know how this control been affected by most recent cases of anti-authoritarian movements, and specifically in case of mainland China, it is Hong Kong. So how this authoritarian control on the internet essentially changed internet in mainland China, and for others, perhaps how it changed internet in Hong Kong and Belarus. Please, Jan.
So the main form of government control over the internet in mainland China is what I'm sure you've all heard of, the Great Firewall of China, which is a term that we use to mean the system of different filters and blocks and of foreign and domestic websites that exist in China. And of course, the Great Firewall is not in one physical location. It's distributed across a bunch of different internet service providers and internet gateways, and so on, between China and the rest of the world. I think one of the big concerns that we all have this year is the spreading of the boundaries of the Great Firewall, and whether Hong Kong might eventually come under the same kind of internet filtering and internet governance as we see in the mainland. And to give you an idea of what that means, of course, there are specific websites that are blocked in China. For example, if I try to open up my phone and on my China Telecom connection and try to connect to google.com or facebook.com or any of a number of blocked websites, then my internet service provider will see the destination of the request as being a blocked website and will basically drop the request. meaning that I can't actually access it without using something like a VPN to get beyond these controls. However, the filtering of keywords is not the only kind of filtering, and the filtering of web domains is not the only kind of filtering that's done under the Great Firewall. I think in the last few years, we've seen this escalation of controls in mainland China. That means that the Great Firewall is also starting to capture the fingerprints of certain kinds of protocols being used. So if I use a VPN connection that under a certain VPN protocol, for example, OpenVPN or WireGuard or other well-known VPN protocols, that the Great Firewall is starting to learn to track the fact that you're using some kind of VPN, even if the server that you're connecting to is not a blocked address. And this kind of filtering technology is obviously very problematic because it means that the people who are designing VPNs then have to be a step ahead of a system that employs thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of engineers across the country, not just within the government, but also within private companies, within internet service providers and so on, within state-owned enterprises to work on the distributed technology of the Great Firewall. And that kind of filtering, I think, if it were to be applied to Hong Kong, would raise a really big issue for the multinationals, the foreign businesses and so on, who are currently present in Hong Kong, which is how do we operate under these intense controls.
Thank you, amazing. Glesha, do you have anything to add regarding Hong Kong? How internet was changed recently as a result of the movement?
I'd say we are moving towards the road of being another Chinese city. Like sadly, as Yuan has said about the Great Firewall, it's slowly but being implemented in Hong Kong. The first website was being blocked under the national security law, and that is deeply worrying. And I'd say in general, the government is trying to either block access to free information or disable free speech, and to be the government has to be the know-it-all. It's somehow replicating the Chinese model, but in a different, adapting it to the Hong Kong scenarios. For example, they're pushing towards real name SIM card policies in the name of anti-terrorism, but basically we know that is trying to prevent that people can they can use like anonymous SIM card to convey messages between each other. And they're trying to use many other methods. For example, but way before the national security law, the government has been using court orders to take down contents from the internet or request online service providers to not host that content. So it's not the first time that we've seen the government trying to implement control over Telegram or other Hong Kong local platforms. And I think the main thing about the whole shifting towards a more like Chinese-style internet policy is that they're trying to implement that mechanism of self-censorship into Hong Kongers' mind, because usually Hong Kongers are like very free and they don't really think about what they're saying, but after they say it, like they don't actually have that thing about self-censorship. But now with all these real name policies of this national security law, they're basically trying to implement that self-censorship into Hong Kongers' mind. Like a lot of netizens in China, they actually think very carefully before they type something on the internet. But in Hong Kong, it's not the case. By introducing new policies or new laws into Hong Kong, Hong Kongers are forced to think about, oh, am I getting myself into trouble? And once you start self-censoring, you are only going to continue. You stop to have that sense of free speech, and you don't feel like you can say whatever you want. And I think this is exactly the fear and the effect that the Hong Kong government wants to see in Hong Kong.
Wow, yes. As a Belarusian myself, I can really relate to what your suggestion regarding the fear of persecution and resulted self-censorship. Let's hear from Belarus. Anyone from Belarus would like to add a few thoughts on that briefly? We heard about Telegram. Anything else beyond Telegram? How internet in Belarus has been changed by the movement?
Yeah, I can go with it. First of all, Belarusian government is following Chinese trends, and they're buying some texts from Chinese colleagues, and they're trying to go the same way. They even been talking about Great Belarusian Firewall, if you can imagine it. But fortunately, the situation is quite different in Belarus, because the state is losing on a free market to independent enterprises, and they're losing the specialists, the engineers. So the level of salary they can propose for specialists is much lower than they can get on a free market. And that's why the level of tech awareness and qualification is much lower. That means that free market is always step ahead. It's been a single case when one of the companies in Minsk appeared to working with the government, and it was a huge scandal. This company is already under European and US sanctions. And it's super toxic for them at the moment being in the Belarusian market, because engineers just are not willing to work there, and they just live in and no one else coming. So it's easier for us in Belarus, but they're moving this way. What had been moved, what had been changed during the protest, as Hanna mentioned already, this level of awareness of regular people. Like everyone have Telegram now. Everyone knows how to use VPN. Lots of people learning how to use blockchain and crypto wallets. So I guess the protest gave a huge impulse for education and technology, and people are willing to do it, and that helps a lot.
Great, thank you. So it seems like we've seen more and more similarities emerging between Chinese content, broader Chinese content, context, and Belarusian context. And unfortunately, not all of them look very positive. But let's. I heard a lot during Belarusian protests that people in Belarus, they've been discussing certain sort of tactics and perspectives that been used in Hong Kong during most recent movement. We don't have much time now, but just a few during those last few minutes, I would like to ask few questions to each of you, and I will start with Glacier. So we heard a lot about learning, Belarusian learning from Hong Kong. Oh, we heard something at least, but have you heard any examples of attempts of Hong Kong activists to learn from Belarus, or say other contexts, if possible, briefly?
We do learn a lot from not only Belarus, but also from Thailand and other places, because most of the time it is not what kind of tools you use that matters the most. It's more like your creativity, like how do you see yourself using those things that matter more. Like Telegram could just be a texting tool that you use with your friends, but under the context of Hong Kong, because of our creativity, or in creativity because of others, it became something new, and it serves like unlimited purposes. So it's more about learning that sense of creativity from each other, like how we inspire each other and how do we learn from each other's lessons. I think that is the most important thing to learn from.
Wow, great. Creativity sounds very important. I agree. All right. What else we heard and what unites all of your perspectives is this notion of leaderless or self-organizing, but specifically leaderless. So it's not unique, in fact, to Hong Kong, a Belarusian story, to claim that a movement, current movement, protest movement that emerged in digital space is leaderless. But maybe there are some leaders. What Yaroslav, what do you think about this idea that movements are leaderless? Do you think there are leaders, or indeed there are no leaders, and these movements are sort of people's movement, totally horizontal, and so on? What do you think?
From my point of view, no movement can exist without leaders. You can have multiple local leaders, but they're still leaders. You can have some strong national leaders, and they are leaders. But there should be leaders. Usually 95% of people are used to follow, and someone has to lead. Yeah, that's again, like, I don't know, dozens of years ago, it's been ability just to physically gather together and vote for something, and then follow this decision. These days, police forces strongly repress any kind of gathering. only if it's not like 100,000 people in the downtown, then they can do nothing. But you cannot discuss anything with 100,000 people. And technology here gives us opportunity to discuss it online, to vote online, to elect leaders online, to make decisions online, and then follow them in the real life. And that's the beauty that we have.
Great, thank you for a succinct answer. Well, and let's hear a bit more about Belarus from Belarusian perspective on things. Hanna, you mentioned that Telegram gained a lot of trust of people, of users, and Jaroslav also mentioned that people learned a lot during this period of contestation. Why do people trust often anonymous administrators and leaders of those multiple Telegram channels and groups that emerged in Belarus during the protest movement? Why do people trust those anonymous users?
Look, I love history. So I look at the revolution in Belarus as an evolution, right? I don't think that people have all of a sudden woken up. This was the evolution, this was a process, and it might not sound as sexy as usually people would love it to kind of explain and show and describe. But in my opinion, that was actually the case. So when it comes to those anonymous internet users, or I would call them influencers, digital influencers, they actually appeared years ago. Let's come back to 2017, when there was this huge wave of protest against this tax on the unemployed. And back then, there were already very important, very famous, very popular people who did not really coordinate the protests, but who were an important part of that protest movement. These were YouTube bloggers. These were people who would post, their videos on YouTube and garner millions of views. And social media brought new heroes who basically used the internet to inform, support, and mobilize civil society. And this kind of growing number of Belarus digital influencers were telling their stories on social media platforms in a way that wouldn't be previously would have been impossible, I would say, or very dangerous, because many journalists by that moment would have, again, this self-censorship that you discussed, right? Because of these killings, because of these disappearances, because of these arrests and repressions against journalists. So digital influencers, those bloggers, kind of came, instead of those journalists who would self-censor themselves, and they've become a reliable source of information, but for many people. And that's how Nexta, the kind of famous Telegram channel today, appeared back then. It was a YouTube channel back then, right? It was a very popular, very kind of important YouTube channel. Or there were kind of important, very famous, well-known bloggers like Anton Matolka, who still kind of is famous and popular nowadays. There were investigations posted on YouTube, in 2017. So basically, this social media phenomenon, like these platforms, they've become popular years ago, and that's how kind of people began trusting them, because they provided more information than even independent media, not to mention state media, which totally kind of lied and which completely controlled by the authorities. And the fact that I think that's kind of the most important thing. It's just because independent media, kind of journalists, they self-censored themselves. And then during this pandemic, right, as I already mentioned, independent media, social media became really, really important, because they provided the real information. People just saw that both Lukashenko and state media lied, so they just needed, to understand what was really happening, because the real situation, what they saw, relatives were sick, friends and colleagues were sick and died. So they kind of understood that something is not really, good with those state media. So they turned to social media and independent media.
All right, thank you. Great. Well, amazing. I don't think we have, maybe we have 1 minute left. Thank you a lot for your answer, Anna. Johan?
Yes, I think a question I'd like to leave everyone with, especially for those in the audience who are not in Hong Kong or mainland China or Belarus, is what role do multinational companies, particularly American tech companies, have in enforcing and enabling the kinds of internet surveillance technology that led to the rise of China's Great Firewall, which, as Yaroslav describes, may now be being exported not just to Hong Kong, but also to Belarus and to other countries. We know already that Cisco and many other US tech companies had a critical role in building the Great Firewall, and that there are still many internet companies in the US who are engaging with Chinese surveillance companies, as the internet wrote about in the Open Power Foundation reporting. So what can we do to curb the growth and the spread of these surveillance business links between China and the rest of the world? Because I think when other authoritarian governments see China's model, they see something that works potentially for them as well.
That's exactly the question I wanted to ask, but do we have an answer? Does anyone want to contribute and suggest what can be done about that?
I think it's people that are not in Belarus or Hong Kong or other places that are being oppressed. I think it's very important to make sure that you let the companies know what you think they need to do. Like, for example, like Apple, they always brand themselves being very hip and very like very human rights loving. And the thing is, they're actually helping like China to crack down on human rights. They ban VPNs, they ban New York Times, and so on in China, in the Chinese market. And their argument is always, "Oh, we don't want to leave the Chinese market because that's only caused more problem, and people are going to be forced to use Huawei, and so on." But that is not a very valid argument, from my perspective. So I think it's very important that you make it very clear to Apple that you have to at least improve your transparency. You have to at least be very open about what you're actually doing in these places and how you're contributing to these kind of human rights violation. And do you indirectly or directly benefit from human rights violation? I think transparency is always the first step to making things change. And I think as consumers outside of these places, you are the ones who will be able to push for that. So I deeply encourage everyone to ask for more transparency in this case.
Thank you, Glesha. I don't think we have any more time left, but it's great to finish on that important question, that important issue. And I encourage everyone, all Belarus, Chinese, Hong Kong watchers, to follow events in these countries, to express your solidarity if you can, or if you can, to influence situation, for instance, through your discussion with mainstream platforms that indeed have became very influential in shaping events in these countries. Please do, and please support this struggle for human rights and democracy in these countries and beyond. Thank you a lot for following and participating, and thank you our panelists for joining. Bye.